we have already learned about new criticism. We started with John Crow Ransom, right, who tries to tell us, look, this is a specialized pursuit, and the professors of literature must take it upon themselves to develop the mode of reading literary texts. So after we go through John Crow Ransom, Clint Brooks basically takes one part of it and tells us, how a paraphrase will not really be a good reading of a poem. So we learn another thing: you can't make an object from a poem and study it. You must study the poem. Now, when we go to Wimsatt and Beardsley, they further hone the technique by suggesting, look, how do you make your work objective? Take yourself out of it. So don't put anything in analysis of a poem about what the poem did to you. How did it move you? How did it bring you to tears? Because that is affective fallacy. That is the fallacy of feeling, right? And the reader must not bring that into the discussion. The other fallacy that mentioned is on the other end of the poem, the authorial end of the poem. So they bracket out intentional fallacy. What they are basically saying is, don't bring materials from outside and say this is what the poem had intended, and if we take this biographical information, we can read the poem better. What they are suggesting is that if you want to read the intention of the author, the poem itself is the arrived intention of the poet. You don't need anything outside the poem to read the intention of the author. If there is a footnote out there or two verses that he or she didn't include in a poem, then it's not part of the poem. If they wanted it to be part of their intention, they would have put it in the poem. So read the finished product and just read that. Do not try to bring anything outside to suggest the intended audience of the poem or intended meaning of the poem. These are the two things that they're dealing with in that very long and convoluted essay. There was also a very strong prejudice in new critics against moral criticism. Okay, what was moral criticism? Moral criticism was that basically assigned value to a poem in terms of its effect, right? That, okay, this poem teaches us these values, this poem teaches us spirituality, I'm just making things up. But when you bring in morality or a moral message of the poem, you are then going into affect. What does it do to the consciousness or feelings of the reader? And that will then be unscientific and something outside of the poem. And hence, moral criticism is also frowned upon because it relies on something outside of the poem to define what it means. When non-professionals wrote reviews of the books, right, or published reviews of poetry collections, these were the two fallacies that they were practicing, right? That, oh, here is a letter from T.S. Eliot in which he says that, and this means that this poem was intended to do this and that. So they were doing that at one end, which is the intentional fallacy, or they were saying, oh, this poem brought me to tears and made me think about little children and how they must go hungry in the world and that the world needs to do something about it. And they're saying, no, take that out as well. So what's then left is the poem, its mechanistic rendering of whatever metaphor, simile that it uses. What does it set up within the first lines? What's the meter? What's the rhythm? What's the rhyme? And then, are there any ambiguities, linguistic ambiguities within the poem itself, which it either resolves or doesn't resolve? So that would then be kind of a scientific, rational reading of a poem. And morality cannot be a part of it, or moral readings cannot be a part of it. By the time these guys are done with it, what we learn then is that the most significant part of this experience of doing literary criticism is the text itself, right? That's the primary thing. Anything that is not in the text must be excluded, and that is autobiography of the author, even the context of the poem sometimes, and anything that the poem does to you as you read it, what it makes you feel, how it impacts you, that is out as well. So all we must focus on is the poem itself. Then we've already learned that we can't even paraphrase the poem, because that defeats the purpose of reading the poem as an organic whole with certain parts that play with each other, right? So if we create a paraphrase of it and start reading the paraphrase, we have created a new object. So things are kind of crystallized and becoming clear. Now remember, these people, one of them also goes and establishes the Kenyan Review, which is still extant, right, as a journal. And so a lot of these practices, these are also the people who kind of actually bring up a crop of poets and writers with these assumptions in mind. So they have enough power not only to articulate themselves, but also to mentor people and bring them up in this style of believing about literature. And that is why new criticism takes such a strong hold in American Academy. It wasn't an accident, it was deeply intentional.